Hey there. You know, I find abstraction is a fun way to inject some creativity into my photography. So that's what I'm going to do today. I've come out to the forest to hunt for some creative abstract compositions. Now, abstraction by its very nature forces you to look at the world in a different way, through a different perspective. So I think it's a great way to get to know these woods a little better. As I go around on my walk, I'll talk about my top tips for abstract photography, and at the end I'll share one technique which, in my experience, never fails to produce something creative and abstract. Let's get going. Hey there, I'm Kevin. For me, photography is a tonic for the mind, really. It's about connecting with this weird and wonderful world around us. It's about being immersed in nature, being present and decompressing, and maybe in the process getting the chance to produce something creative and fulfilling. As you've seen, I found this wonderful, massive fallen oak, and I think this is an interesting place to start looking for compositions. And probably a good place to start with my first tip. My first tip is there is no right or wrong with abstract photography. At the end of the day, it's an artistic endeavour. It's about trying to create an interesting image through form and colour and shapes and textures. So it's not about realism. It's about your artistic intuition and where you can break rules around composition and exposure and focus. It's about playing, being creative, producing something interesting and intriguing with what you find around you. So let's have a go. There's some interesting shapes and forms in here. So I'm going to try to take a few pictures using the different elements of this good old fallen tree. I've set my camera in aperture priority mode because I want to control really the depth of field on here, although most of the photos I'll take are of very shallow subjects. To me, this is a really interesting part of the forest. Several years ago, they put the Meander back in the streams. So that stream I've just crossed is the old Meander that used to be there maybe a few hundred years ago. But back in the 17 or maybe 1800s, they put straight lines, straight ditches through these lowland parts of the forest to drain them so that they could grow more wood. And recently they started putting back those meanders in different parts of the forest, and it does start to change its character and actually, I think, improves it a hell of a lot. I've come up from the stream just over there in the wetland areas up into a drier part of the forest, which is covered in this beautiful leaf litter, a deep golden brown, and has lots of large trees covered in deep green moss. So that's quite a beautiful contrast for me to work with, and let's see what I can find here. In fact, this brings me on nicely to my next tip, which is keep it simple. Try using bold shapes and colours, and not too many of them, just to create some very striking and simple compositions. Photographers like Fontana use that to great effect in landscape photography, where you use block colours in different aspects of the landscape to produce some beautiful photographs. So that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to hunt for some basic shapes and colour contrast. These green tree roots are like fingers going down into the sea of leaf litter. So that could be quite interesting if we can find something around that. I've taken a couple of shots there, but let's go and have a look a little bit deeper into the forest. I found another massive beech tree here, which is more out in the open, but it has beautiful roots coming down into the leaf litter. So I think I'm going to have a go at this one as well, see if this one gets some better pictures. Over here I've just found there's like a little river of leaves coming down in between two of the roots, moss covered roots. And I love that contrast where you've got these reddy brown leaves against the deep green moss of the tree. It'd be a bit nicer if it had been maybe a little bit damp or something like that, just to give me a little bit more interesting texture to work with. But I think this is great anyway. It's the middle of autumn, and to me that's a great time to find a subject of my next shot and my next tip. My next tip is really about textures. Look for and take pictures of textures. They're really quite interesting shapes. Photographers like Siskind spend a lot of their career just focusing on taking pictures of textures. Well, one of the typical autumn things that give us texture are fungi, and of course there's loads in these woods. Here I've just got some bright yellow puffballs, so I think I'll use those. Now, one of the things about shots of textures like this is quite often you're not quite sure when you see the image itself of its perspective and its scale. If you think about shots quite often of landscapes taken from the air, they'll look virtually no different to shots taken of small little elements like this. What I found here is a small plantation of huge pine trees, so I presume grown for timber. And what I'm hoping to find here is some way of using all these parallel vertical lines to create an interesting composition that gives us different depth and different layers using those lines. And that's my next tip really. It's about using layers to create interest within the composition. Let's see what I can find. I've seen a composition here I think might work. It's not the best, but I think it will hopefully work just enough to prove the concept I'm trying to create. So I've got all of these vertical trunks with a few horizontal and diagonal branches coming out. They're quite clumped together and there's quite a lot of depth all the way through. So that's what I'm going to work on. I'll probably set it to manual focus, and I'm not quite sure whether I'm going to focus on something in the distance to draw your eye through all of these vertical trunks, or whether I'll try to pick something in the midground. But let's see, let's just take a couple of shots and I'll see what comes out best. Now what I'm trying to do is to take a shot that's cropped so tight in that you're not immediately aware of what these vertical things are. You're not immediately aware that you're looking at tree trunks. That's the effect I'm hoping for, but it's quite hard to achieve. I really should have brought some a ladder or something like that to get myself a bit higher up. And I'm moving side to side to see what point of interest do I get in the background, and which ones do I want to pick on and which ones do I want to hide out of the way. Now I don't want any foreground at all in this because that will give the game away. And I think for that shot I quite like these white-ish diagonal branches that were coming out because they catch the eye, and that's something that throws your eye around the picture then. Okay, so I think that's the best I can do with that shot. Let's move on to the next shot. What I want to try to do now is to try to find something that gives me a little bit of movement in the shot, and hopefully some colour with that as well. That's my next tip really. It's about movement, introducing some movement into the shot, some blur or something like that to add a bit of artistic interest. Of course, movement could be natural movement that you get either, with the wind, waves crashing and splashing up, or water, stream, something like that. And of course, if you play with shutter speed and movement, you get some interesting blur effects. That's really what this is all about. It's about how you can use blur artistically. Well, one way of doing it is to rely on the world around us to move, or we can actually move the camera ourselves, which is called intentional camera movement, ICM. And it's a really easy and great fun way to get some quite creative blurry images. So here I've got some bracken turning, so there's greens, yellows, browns. So hopefully that will give me a background that I can use and just create some blurs. The best thing to do is actually just to play around with different settings on your camera. I've set this all up to manual just so I can control everything in camera, and it's not trying to do anything for itself, it's just doing what I want. And what I'll do is I'll just move the camera, and as I move it I'll click the shutter. I've got quite a low speed on here. I've played around with a few different ones, and I carry on to play around with them. So I think I'm about somewhere between, third of a second, quarter of a second. As I play around and look at the shots on the back of the screen, I can adjust any of those settings to give me the effect that I want. In terms of movements, there's quite a few different movements you can take that produce some really stunning effects. So one way would be to give you a horizontal sweep. If you give a horizontal sweep, particularly at the seaside or something like that, where you do have these horizontal layers, whether it's beach, sea, some land maybe, and some sky, some clouds, that gives you some nice horizontal stripes. Other ones, common ones to do, are really just camera wobbles. So you can click the camera, keep it in where it is, and then just wobble it halfway through that shutter staying open. So it fixes the image as it's taken and then blurs it. You can do circles with it, any really type of movement that you want. And I think the key thing is to try. So I've got some bracken here. I'm actually playing with the stems because the stems are quite long lines against the green, the yellow stems along against the green, and I'm just going to move up and down the stems to try to create a blurry image using those. So let's see what we get. I could do with a bit more light again. That's been the problem all today, has been this very, very flat light. So all I'm doing are these sweeps with the camera to try to capture those stems. Okay, so I think it's time for me to pack up and head home. I've had a really enjoyable afternoon out here in the forest. Hopefully you've enjoyed tagging along with me too, and I'll see you next time.